like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Serious crap.
The humble frog, one of the most iconic creatures on the planet. Yet it lacks the grandiose size of whales, the grace of a fox, or the strength of a gorilla. It does not induce the awe of eagles and lions, the fear of snakes or sharks, or wolves for that matter, or the love of cats and dogs, or even the hatred of roaches and rats. Yet nonetheless, this small creature that spans nearly every continent except Antarctica can be found nearly anywhere with fresh water, has played a significant role in our cuisine, folklore, fairy tales, and pop culture. If you are new to this obscure YouTube channel, I'm running a series on humanity's relationship with various animals. While most of these videos have been about cats, dogs, cattle, chicken, mosquitoes, and others that have gotten a lot of attention, I want to focus on an animal that is fairly neglected in these conversations. If I were to describe the frog in human terms, I would say it would be duality. In fact, the group of animals frogs and toads belong to are called amphibians, which in Greek translates into double life. This is because they start their lives as tadpoles in water and then transform into quasi-terrestrial adults on land. This transition is known as metamorphosis. This is where we get the term amphibious from, oftentimes used in military speak when it comes to operations that involve both the land and water. There's also a term called toad. Granted, this is not a scientifically accurate term. They are not a taxonomic category. Toads are frogs, namely ones that are generally speaking more terrestrial, oftentimes with less color, rougher skin, and for a lack of a better word, ugly. Such a duality, both in terms of lifespan and habitat, has made them a source of fascination for various human cultures. And the duality doesn't stop there. Frogs make up some of the most beautiful creatures, and some of the, well, ugliest. Some of the most harmless, and some of the deadliest. Some of the most successful, and some of the most critically endangered. Frogs date back long before humans, dating back to the Triassic period. The earliest frog-like ancestor is... I'm not going to bother pronouncing that, read it yourself. These probably date back to a creature similar to a lungfish, further back during the Devonian period. Lungfish use lungs to get oxygen from the air when they're in stagnant bodies of water, which by and large are pretty lacking in oxygen. Some creatures probably thought, hey, let's ditch the water altogether and chill on some land, because, it might be easier to breathe, and breathing is, after all, quite a pleasant experience, certainly more pleasant than not breathing. These creatures would probably spend both their time in the marine water and on land. However, some would eventually make their way to freshwater bodies more inland. From there, a massive diversification of species would emerge, some suited to the ponds, others to rivers, some in more tropical heat, others in cooler temperatures, some in the trees, and even a few in the desert. They became an integral part of whatever ecosystem they lived in, as both predators and prey. The largest of species was the devil frog that ruled over Madagascar during the Cretaceous period, the time of the dinosaurs. This beast was around 40 centimeters or 16 inches, modest by the standards of many mammals, fish, and reptiles, but massive when it comes to modern-day amphibians. The most likely represented frog similar to this is the modern-day Pac-Man frog common in the pet trade. Long after these mega frogs kicked the bucket, some other frogs would eventually encounter another peculiar species, humans. They would spread throughout much of the world from Africa, encountering frogs nearly anywhere there was drinkable water. From Africa, the Middle East, Europe, the Americas, and Australia, frogs took a place in virtually every type of human folklore, and almost never as the main character, but somehow managed to hop into the story. It's difficult to keep track of those coming from oral traditions, but the first societies with written languages made their interest in these slimy little critters known. The ancient Sumerians, the first complex human civilization with a written language, saw frogs as servants of the water god Enki. Fitting, given that ancient Mesopotamia was between two freshwater rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which provided fresh vegetation, food for both man and frog alike. In ancient Egypt, Frogs were seen as symbols of the fertility and life of that civilization. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt was also dependent on a river, namely the Nile. And as the Nile flooded, it provided Egyptians with water, and namely water for their crops. The Nile also allowed frogs to spawn their eggs in, which resulted in an avalanche of tadpoles. And keep in mind that this was all in the middle of a desert wasteland. As a result of this, the abundance of frogs became a symbol of fertility and the triumph of life. There was even a god called Kek, oftentimes depicted as a frog, which represents the chaos and darkness before light came into the universe. Kek was an obscure Egyptian god in the pantheon that nonetheless came to resemble the unknown and the obscure. Kek is sometimes depicted as a male frog and sometimes as a female serpent. This again ties to the concept of duality. Sometimes Kek was associated with the primeval darkness, and sometimes associated with the light that came out of the primordial darkness. Kek was not necessarily evil, but rather representing the distant past, shrouded in mystery. The sort of first causation which humans to this day can't really fathom. Why a frog would symbolize this? Well, I'm not sure. Perhaps it has to do with their origins as tadpoles, and the metamorphosis that they must undergo to become true frogs. What I am sure of is that this obscure god, worshipped for thousands of years ago before Christ, would eventually come to prominence during the 2016 election in the midst of Donald Trump supporters who would use Kek as a meme/symbol of right-wing populism. Going on to more important matters in history, in ancient Greece, they also had frogs. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, fertility, and lust, in particular, liked frogs. Fitting, since frog species lay hundreds of eggs at the same time. At least, many of them do. While not exactly a quote-unquote sexy creature, frogs have been associated with fertility as they are an R-selected species, meaning that they reproduce by placing a very large quantity of eggs. Quantity over quality. They usually have a ton of offspring, most of whom will not make it to adulthood and receive almost no care. With that being said, it doesn't mean that they're totally deadbeat parents. Some frogs, and particularly frog dads, do care for their offspring. African bullfrog dads will protect those eggs, and Santa Isabella frog dads will oftentimes carry the eggs on their backs from their partners and safely bring them to the water. And you probably thought only mammals and birds took care of their kids. Frogs would eventually find their way to mythology and folklore. The Greek storyteller Aesop used frogs in many of his moral tales. Going back to Egypt, most of you are probably familiar with the story of Exodus from the Bible. When one of the plagues God sends down on Egypt as punishment for their treatment of the Israelites were a ton of frogs. Granted, one of the other plagues was composed of bugs, and frogs probably are not so much of a curse than a blessing if you are plagued with insects. Northern Europe would also evoke the frog in the tale of the Frog Prince, in which a prince in the form of a frog must convince the beautiful princess to give him a chance. Various versions of this tale can be found across much of Central and Eastern Europe. Perhaps it resonated with ugly guys who want to bang the hot girl. Granted, the theme of transformation from frog to prince is rather fitting for an animal that goes through metamorphosis. In more recent decades, frogs have been a mainstay in pop culture. The most famous is Kermit the Frog, who is quite beloved from the Muppets, as opposed to Slippy the Toad from Sky Fox, who is widely hated. And sure, I'll count Peppy the Frog as well. Some species of frogs have become national symbols, such as the stunning red-eyed tree frogs from Costa Rica. Frogs have also played a very important role in many indigenous cultures of the rainforest. For example, poison dart frogs have been used for hunting and warfare. The colors of these frogs are a sign telling potential predators to back away. These critters don't have claws or teeth, but they are among the most dangerous on the planet. These dart frogs contain poison, which they develop from folic acid of the ants that they consume, which in turn can be produced from the ants eating specific types of plants in the rainforest. Some of these frogs have the ability to kill dozens of grown humans. However, since these don't eat Amazonian ants in captivity, they are not poisonous in captivity, and have become very popular in the pet trade, as they have easy-to-care conditions, and they have beautiful colors. Other frogs that are oftentimes kept as pets are Pac-Man frogs, fire-belly toads, and African clawed frogs. Although these guys aren't quite as pretty. Frogs have also been used to study muscle physiology and are a common mainstay in teaching anatomy and physiology in American science classrooms in high school. The aforementioned African claw frog was in fact the first vertebrate cloned in the lab, decades before Dolly the sheep. Other frogs have been utilized as a food source, namely for their legs, eaten around much of the Francophone world, most notably by the Cajuns in southern Louisiana. Granted, frogs have never been a major source of protein for most cultures. Going back to science, frogs may also be the canary in the coal mine for conservation and ecological destruction. Frogs, as cool as they are actually some of the most vulnerable creatures. Their duality of water and land oftentimes has made them undergo adaptations to both biomes, and as a result of that, they oftentimes half-ass their adaptations. After all, they have to make trade-offs between water and land. Most of them, at least, aside from the fully aquatic ones or the ones that bury themselves in the desert covered in their own mucus. This, after all, limits their range. On top of that, frogs have porous skin, which while being well adapted to freshwater also makes them vulnerable to drying out if the humidity is too low, or if there's a drought. It also allows toxins to easily enter their bodies. Alex Jones's aforementioned meltdown was kind of true. Frogs are not turning gay, as he said, and they're certainly not wearing short shorts or going to pride parades, but women taking contraceptives who pee out the synthetic estrogen can sometimes cause male frogs in ponds in urban areas and suburban areas to become hermaphrodites. There still needs to be more research done on this, but I guess contraception is doing to frogs what Alex Jones thinks soy milk is doing to young men. Amphibian populations have already been hit some of the hardest, and conservationists are very concerned. One of the biggest icons of the crisis of amphibian conservation was the golden toad, which went extinct in Costa Rica during the late 1980s, and has become an icon of much of the environmental crises that we're facing around the planet. Even if you don't really care about these sometimes charismatic, sometimes uncharismatic creatures, they are a bellwether for the challenges us humans and our co-inhabitants on this planet face. And it's about time we pay more attention to them, for their sake and for our own sake.